Some mornings arrive without warning. No sun, no sound, just the weight of something about to happen. A black veteran steps into a small-town diner, wet boots, tired eyes, coat heavy with memory. He asks for coffee. That's all. But to two officers at the counter, he's not a customer. He's a threat. They see the bag, the silence, the worn uniform, and decide he doesn't belong. They try to shame him, push him, corner him, but they don't know who he is, and they sure don't know who he can call. Because sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the loudest. Sometimes he just makes one phone call, and careers end before the coffee even cools. So tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it? It was the kind of morning where the cold didn't just nip at your skin, it reached deep into your bones and settled there quiet and unforgiving. The sky had turned the color of unwashed wool, and a fine mist clung to the branches, like it didn't know how to let go. Elijah Carter moved slowly up the slight hill from the underpass, each step pressing the dampness deeper into the worn soles of his boots, each breath drawing in air that tasted like rust and rain. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a weather-beaten navy parka, the kind that had once been crisp and official, but now sagged at the seams, frayed at the cuffs, and carried the faint smell of campfire and road salt. Slung across his back was a duffel bag olive green, stained in places duct-taped, in others its strap biting into his shoulder like a dull accusation. He didn't look up as the truck stop diner came into view. There was no need. He knew this kind of place by heart, off-brand neon blinking over a name nobody remembered, a home cookin' sign, half-lit and swaying gently with the wind. Inside, he imagined the clatter of forks on plates, the hum of a jukebox stuck on an old country song, and the dry warmth of coffee pots that had never been properly cleaned. He walked through the parking lot slow, like someone with nowhere better to be, and pushed open the glass door with the flat of his hand, setting off a tinny bell that rang sharp against the muffled drone of conversation. The warmth hit him first, greasy, tired, but welcome. Then came the stares. Not all of them direct, but enough to settle like a second coat on his shoulders. One man in a Carhartt jacket looked up from his eggs, paused, and returned to chewing. A young couple by the window glanced, then leaned in closer together like bad weather had followed him inside. Elijah didn't flinch. He just nodded once slow, like a man greeting a familiar kind of silence, and made his way to the booth in the far corner, the one with the cracked pleather seat and the window fogged over with breath and weather. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait to be seated. He just sat down slow and careful, easing his bag to the floor with a soft thud, and pulling off his gloves one finger at a time. His hands were rough and cracked, the nails uneven, the skin dark and weathered. From his coat pocket he pulled out a $5 bill worn soft from folding, and smoothed it gently on the table like it was the most important thing he owned. A waitress appeared, mid-20s, pale face, red ponytail pulled through the back of a worn ball cap. Her name tag read Jenna, and she hesitated just a little too long before speaking. "Can I help you with something?" Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. Elijah looked up, eyes, steady voice even. "Just a coffee," he said, "hot, if it's not too much trouble." Jenna nodded, glanced toward the counter, then walked away without another word. Her shoes squeaked slightly on the linoleum. The moment stretched out behind her like a trail of wet footprints. Elijah leaned back against the booth, his spine cracking audibly. The cushion resisted him with a kind of tired resilience, sticking faintly to the back of his damp coat. He exhaled slowly and let his eyes close, just for a moment, trying to forget the cold that still lingered in his bones. In the background, a clock ticked. A coffee machine hissed. Somewhere near the kitchen, someone laughed too loud, then caught themselves. He didn't need to open his eyes to feel the weight of the room. He had felt it in truck stops, shelters, and libraries, places that tolerated him until they didn't, in Diev. Places that offered comfort, but only in small, measured doses. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't chasing kindness. He just wanted a moment of warmth, a quiet seat, and something hot to hold between his hands. Nothing more. Nothing less. When the door chimed again, he knew without looking that something had shifted. Not the weather outside, but the atmosphere inside. The low murmur of conversation dipped, then steadied as two men in uniform entered. The kind of uniform that came with the scent of command and the assurance of unquestioned presence. County deputies. One tall, square-jawed, the other younger, leaner eyes scanning like he wasn't sure why they were there but wouldn't question it either. Their boots were clean. Their smiles were absent. Elijah didn't look up. Not yet. He reached for the napkin dispenser, pulled one free, and wiped a bit of condensation from the edge of the window. The glass was still too fogged to see through, just shadows and shapes outside moving past in the mist, but he could see their reflections behind him. The taller one, Bell, if the stitched name tag was right, pointed in his direction with a subtle tilt of his chin. The other Mercer nodded slightly. Footsteps. Calm, deliberate, like the kind of approach you practice, not the kind that comes from curiosity. Elijah kept his hands visible flat on the table and waited. There was a difference between being still and being afraid. He had learned that a long time ago. Bell's voice came from over his shoulder, smooth and measured. "Morning, sir. You here with someone?" Elijah turned his head slowly. Met the man's gaze without blinking. "No," he said. "Just waiting on that coffee." Mercer stepped in closer, arms crossed, scanning the table like he expected something to jump out. Bell tilted his head, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. "You just passing through, or you planning to stay a while?" Elijah's lips curved, but not into a smile. "Is that a question or a concern?" Bell chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Depends. We've had some trouble lately. Just keeping an eye out." Elijah said nothing. The silence stretched, then broke, as Jenna returned with a white ceramic mug and set it down her hand, brushing against Elijah's wrist for just a second longer than necessary. "Here you go," she said, voice softer than before. "It's on the house." Bell's eyes narrowed. Mercer shifted his weight. Elijah picked up the mug, cradled it in both hands, and finally smiled, small, quiet, and tired. "Appreciate it," he said, but his eyes never left the deputy's face. Not for a second. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It slid in quietly like fog rolling under a locked door, unnoticed, until it wrapped itself around the ankles of every person in the diner. Elijah felt it in the shift of eyes that no longer glanced but lingered, in the sudden hush that fell over the booth behind him, where two truckers had been arguing over football just minutes before. Deputy Bell was still standing over him, posture relaxed in a way that only made it feel more deliberate, like a man who knew the room belonged to him, until someone said otherwise, and no one ever said otherwise. Bell's gaze drifted from Elijah's face down to the duffel at his feet, then back again, his mouth forming a line that wasn't quite a smile. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward the bag. Elijah gave a single slow nod in return. "Looks heavy," Bell said. "You carrying tools or just memories?" The question hung there, not really waiting for an answer. Mercer, standing just behind him, gave a quiet huff of amusement that didn't quite match the uneasy way his eyes were darting around the diner. Jenna had disappeared back behind the counter hands, busy with anything she could grab, but her ears were tilted toward them like antennae tuned to static. Elijah took another sip of his coffee, not because he was thirsty, but because it bought him a second to decide how much dignity he was willing to spend on this encounter. "It's just a bag," he said quietly. "Same as this is just a cup of coffee." Bell crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to eye level like he was about to share a secret. "See, that's the thing," he said, voice low. "It looks like coffee, but when folks like you show up, it starts feeling like a disturbance." The words didn't shock Elijah. He'd heard worse from men with fewer syllables in their mouths, but they carved something deep anyway, not because of what was said, but because of how easily it was. He set the cup down with care, the ceramic clinking gently on the table, and looked Bell in the eye with the calm of someone who's been through things most people couldn't imagine, and made peace with the fact that not everyone survives everything. "That?" so he said, almost softly. "Then maybe it's not the coffee that's the problem." Bell's smile slipped for just a fraction of a second, replaced by something harder, something colder, before he stood up again with a long exhale, as if disappointed that the conversation hadn't gone the way he planned. "I'm going to need you to pick up that bag," he said now, with the tone of a man making a decision instead of asking a question. Elijah didn't move right away. His fingers tapped once against the side of his mug, not nervous, just thoughtful. "You worried someone's gonna trip over it?" he asked. "Or just not happy it's still attached to someone like me?" Mercer shifted uncomfortably, looking out the window, as if hoping someone outside might walk in and save him from the moment. Bell didn't answer, just nudged the duffel with the tip of his boot, not hard but pointed like punctuation. The small act changed everything. It wasn't violent, not really, not enough to raise alarm bells or start a lawsuit, but it was invasive. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't lash out. He just leaned forward, bent down slowly, and lifted the bag by the strap, placing it beside him on the seat like it was something precious instead of worn, and full of nothing worth stealing. Then he looked back at Bell, expression unchanged, voice steady. "You ever serve?" he asked, not as a challenge but as a measure, as if trying to locate the last piece of shared humanity in a place where it was quickly vanishing. Bell's brow twitched just slightly. "What's that got to do with anything?" he shot back. Elijah shrugged. "Nothing, probably. Just helps me figure out how much patience I should keep in my pocket today." Mercer finally spoke, his voice lower, uncertain. "Let's not make this difficult." The irony of that didn't escape Elijah, who gave the younger deputy a tired look, not full of anger, just the weight of years. "I didn't come here to make anything difficult," he said. "I came here to sit, maybe drink something hot, then leave. That's it." "But some folks might be uncomfortable," Bell replied, tone soft now, as if wrapping judgment in velvet made it less cruel. Elijah's eyes darkened, not in rage but in disappointment. "I know how that goes," he said. "I also know how it goes when the people in charge start valuing comfort over decency." There it was, the first real crack in the air, the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet but electric, like the seconds before thunder. The people in the diner hadn't stopped eating, but their movements had slowed, forks, suspended, glances drifting. No one wanted to be involved, but no one could quite look away either. Bell's mouth tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that in his uniform, especially not by someone who looked like they hadn't had a home address in years. His authority was supposed to be a given, his voice the final word. But Elijah didn't seem to care. He sat still, duffel beside him, mug in hand, and in that moment he looked less like a man being harassed and more like someone waiting for a storm he knew how to survive. He'd seen storms, overseas, in alleys and courtrooms, in the eyes of men who thought power was permission. Bell didn't move, but the stance of his body changed a little, stiffer now, like control was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to hold it tighter without crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Mercer looked down. Jenna peeked over the counter again, her lips pressed together like she wanted to speak but hadn't found the right word yet. The room didn't breathe. The coffee cooled. And Elijah, for all the pressure circling him like a slow hurricane, didn't blink. He'd already made his choice long before the deputies walked in. He was done folding, done shrinking. And even if nobody else said it out loud, everyone could feel it. Something had shifted, and there would be no going back. There's a moment right before things tip, where time stretches just enough to let everyone in the room feel it coming. An invisible shift, like pressure dropping before a storm, subtle but unmistakable. Elijah knew that feeling, well, could sense it in the way Deputy Bell's stance stiffened, in the way Mercer's hands moved from crossed arms to clenched fists resting at his sides, not from anger but uncertainty. The diner had gone quieter than it should have been, like the walls themselves were listening, like even the steam rising from the kitchen knew something was wrong and had decided to pause. Elijah didn't move. He didn't need to. Men like Bell were always waiting for a reaction, a flinch, a raised voice, something they could grab onto and twist into justification. Elijah's stillness wasn't weakness. It was experience. Bell took another step forward, just enough to enter Elijah's space, close enough for the scent of cheap cologne and fresh leather to overpower the smell of burnt bacon and fryer oil. "I've given you a chance to make this easy," he said, voice low, eyes sharp. "But you're starting to make folks uncomfortable." Elijah didn't look away. "Funny," he replied. "I was thinking the same thing about you." The words weren't loud, not sharp or sarcastic, but they landed like a dropped stone in still water, sudden, final, and impossible to ignore. Bell's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to Mercer as if looking for backup, or maybe just to remind the room that he wasn't alone. Mercer, to his credit, didn't respond. He shifted slightly, but stayed back, his posture no longer confident, more like a man watching the edge of a cliff and wondering what happens if someone slips. Jenna reappeared near the counter, a dish towel in her hand that she kept wringing like it held. Answers her face, pale lips parted just enough to suggest she wanted to speak but hadn't found the courage yet. The manager, Craig, had stepped out of the kitchen just far enough to lean against the doorframe, arms folded, expression unreadable but wary, like a man who'd seen enough trouble in his life to know it rarely ends cleanly. Bell didn't like being challenged, not by anyone, and especially not by someone he'd already written off as irrelevant. He stepped back just enough to draw breath, then leaned in again, elbows on the edge of the booth, lowering his voice like they were sharing something intimate. "Let me guess," he said, sneering now. "You one of those who comes back from war thinking this country owes you something, medal in one pocket, entitlement in the other." The sentence hung in the air like smoke, thin, acrid, impossible to ignore. Elijah blinked once slowly. His breath was steady. His hands rested on the table, fingers slightly curled but relaxed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question settle, let the weight of it fill the silence, so everyone in the diner could feel its shape. Then he spoke, calm as ever. "You know what I came back with?" he asked, voice just above a whisper. "A limp, a bronze star I keep buried in a sock. And no permanent address." His eyes never left Bell's face. "I didn't ask for handouts. I asked for peace. But peace doesn't come easy when you've got men like you, mistaking quiet for weakness." For a moment, nothing moved. Not Bell, not Mercer, not even the spoon that had been halfway to someone's mouth across the room. Elijah's words cut not because they were loud or angry, but because they were true, raw, measured truth that didn't need to shout to be heard. Bell stepped back instinctively, like a man brushing off something he didn't expect to feel, and glanced toward the window as if the parking lot might offer him a way out of the moment. Mercer muttered something under his breath, unintelligible, and took another step away, his arms folded now more in self-protection than authority. "You're sharp," Bell said, finally masking discomfort with mock approval. "I'll give you that. But you're still leaving." Elijah tilted his head slightly, just enough to make the motion noticeable. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat. Slowly, deliberately, so there could be no misunderstanding. The move wasn't threatening, but it made Bell tense anyway, his hand drifting close to his belt, not quite touching the holster but near enough to send a message. Jenna gasped softly, but Elijah didn't flinch. He pulled out a flip phone, old, scratched, taped at the corner but functional, and set it gently on the table. Bell scoffed. "You gonna call a lawyer with that thing?" Elijah smiled faintly, almost sadly. "No," he said. "Just an old friend." He flipped the phone open with a practiced flick, the screen glowing a faint green, and pressed a number with the ease of habit. The ring was barely audible, but the silence around it made it feel louder. "Cam," Elijah said quietly into the receiver. "Yeah, it's me. I'm at the truck stop diner off County 12. 2 deputies here. Badge numbers? Hold on." He looked up at Bell and Mercer, calm, steady. "You want to make this official?" he asked, "or should I just guess?" Bell opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mercer looked at the floor. Elijah turned back to the phone. "I don't know what kind of favors you still owe me," he said, "but I need one cashed in fast." He closed the phone and placed it back on the table like nothing had happened. No drama, no bravado, just a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't need explaining. And just like that, the air shifted again. Something about the way he said it, the way he moved, the way he didn't flinch, people noticed. Jenna stepped away from the counter without a word. The old man at the back booth finally looked up. Even Craig unfolded his arms, his brow furrowed like he'd just realized this wasn't going the way anyone had expected. Bell stood frozen, his authority suddenly fragile, as if the badge on his chest had lost some of its shine. Mercer turned toward the door, then back again, caught between orders and instincts. And Elijah. He sat exactly as he had before, one hand resting on his coffee mug, the other lightly touching the corner of his coat, as if to remind himself he'd already done the hardest part. He'd decided not to back down. Outside the diner, the mist had thickened into a fine drizzle, tracing silver lines down the window panes and casting the parking lot in a dim watercolor haze. But inside, the silence had taken on a new shape, no longer wary or curious. Now it was charged full of the unspoken weight of men deciding whether to step forward or back. Elijah sat still, the soft buzz of the closed flip phone lingering in the air, like a low hum of warning. His posture relaxed, but purposeful hands, open eyes focused, as if every nerve in his body was listening, not just for movement, but for motive. Deputy Bell hadn't moved in nearly a minute, though. His body was screaming with tension, fingers flexing slightly at his sides, as if trying to find something to grip that wouldn't betray how uncertain he felt now. The confidence that had driven his boots across the tile floor had dulled, replaced by a slower calculation, a search for control in a situation that had quietly slipped out from under him. Mercer, standing a pace behind, kept glancing toward the door, not because he was ready to leave, but because he wasn't sure if staying meant he'd be standing on the right side of what came next. "You know what that call just did?" Bell finally asked, his voice low, brittle at the edges. "Nothing. You think you're gonna scare someone like me with a damn phone call?" Elijah didn't answer, not right away. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just a fraction, like he was looking at a man trying to convince himself of his own authority. "You're not scared," Elijah said, his voice calm, steady, "but you are out of your depth, and we both know it." The words didn't rise above a conversational tone, but they landed with a weight that made Jenna, still behind the counter, draw in a sharp breath. The manager, Craig, now fully out of the kitchen, took a cautious step closer, not because he wanted to intervene, but because something in him knew this was the moment where things either cracked wide open or quietly resolved, and that just maybe it depended on how this man in a worn coat and taped phone kept holding the line. Bell stepped back half a step, subtle but visible, like a boxer recalculating distance mid-round. His face betrayed a flicker of something unfamiliar, doubt, maybe even fear, but it was gone as fast as it came, replaced by a sneer meant to hide whatever it was he didn't want the room to see. "You've got a mouth on you," he muttered, trying to reassert some sense of control, "but none of this changes the fact you're loitering in a place that didn't invite you." Elijah didn't blink. "Paid for the coffee," he said, lifting the cup just slightly in his hand. "Same as anyone else here." Mercer cleared his throat behind Bell, like he wanted to speak but couldn't quite find the words. His eyes met Elijah's for a second too long before dropping to the floor. "He's not wrong," Mercer mumbled almost to himself, but the words were out there now, and everyone heard them. Bell turned his head sharply. "What'd you say?" Mercer straightened his spine, but his voice didn't get louder. "He paid. He's sitting. He hasn't done anything." That was the second crack, the kind that doesn't break a structure but shifts its foundation just enough to make everyone notice. Bell's stare burned into his partner, not with betrayal but frustration, like someone watching a lever stop working mid-pull. Elijah sat back slightly, his shoulders easing just enough to let a quiet breath pass between his lips. Not relief, not yet, but a shift, like a soldier, recognizing a change in terrain and knowing the next move matters most. Then Jenna stepped forward. Just a few steps, her sneakers squeaking against the floor dish towel still clutched in one hand like a shield. She didn't speak right away, and when she did, her voice was soft but firm. "He's not causing trouble," she said, eyes on Bell, not flinching. He ordered. "He paid. That's more than some of the regulars do." Craig looked at her, then nodded once slowly, as if realizing this was the moment he had to choose what kind of manager, what kind of man he was willing to be. "She's right," Craig said. "If you've got something official to say, say it. Otherwise, maybe it's time to let the man finish his coffee." Bell's mouth opened, then closed. The silence pressed in again, not empty but full of possibility of reckoning. The badge on his chest hadn't changed, but somehow it felt less like armor and more like weight. Elijah held his gaze for a long second, then took another sip from his cup. "Not looking for trouble," he said quietly. "Just looking to be left alone." Belle looked around the diner, at Mercer, at Jenna, at Craig, at the quiet faces of customers who'd stopped pretending not to watch, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that the room was no longer with him. He muttered something under his breath, stepped back and turned toward the door, the sound of his boots now heavier, like they dragged the morning's shame with them. Elijah didn't watch him leave. He kept his eyes on his coffee, letting the heat soak into his hands like a quiet reward. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, but the window remained fogged, softening the view into something less harsh. Mercer lingered near the door, his hand resting on the handle, and after a pause, he looked back. "Who'd you call?" he asked, voice lower, curious, more than accusatory. Elijah didn't look up. "Someone who still remembers what integrity looks like," he said. Mercer nodded once. Not a yes, not an agreement, just acknowledgement, the kind that lives somewhere between regret and respect. Then he pushed open the door and walked out into the morning light that was finally starting to break through the clouds. Inside the diner, the tension eased, not like a snap, but like a knot slowly coming undone. Elijah exhaled long and quiet, and for the first time that day, he let himself believe he might finish his coffee in peace. The door hadn't been closed for more than a minute before the silence in the diner shifted again, not back to normal, but to something suspended like a room holding its breath. Elijah stayed, seated, his fingers wrapped around the now lukewarm coffee cup, the ceramic no longer offering warmth but still grounding him, still giving him something to hold on to, while the storm he'd just endured began to settle into the bones of the place. He didn't move quickly, didn't reach for anything, didn't scan the room for approval or sympathy. He'd learned long ago that survival isn't always loud, that dignity doesn't announce itself, it just stays rooted when everything around it tries to push it away. Jenna stepped back behind the counter, her movements a little slower now, her shoulders still tight from the tension that had hung so heavy over them all. Craig had returned to the kitchen, but not fully. He kept one foot in the doorway, watching through the pass window like a man not quite sure if the fire was out or just smoldering. A few customers resumed, eating, the quiet clink of forks on plates returning, but the air still felt heavy, as if the room hadn't decided yet whether what had just happened was over or only just beginning. Elijah took a slow sip from his mug and placed it down with care, fingers lingering on the rim. He knew that what came next mattered just as much as everything that had happened before. You don't get to make a stand, however small, and then walk away like nothing's changed. The moment had been drawn, the line held. But the world doesn't shift on one act alone. It needs proof. It needs follow-through. And for that, sometimes you need a second move. He reached for his coat, his fingers slipping into the inner pocket, where the worn plastic casing of the flip phone still rested cool and familiar. The call earlier had been short, intentional, but enough to spark movement. Now, as the air inside the diner continued to thrum with the aftertaste of confrontation, he flipped it open again, pressed one button and held it to his ear. The dial tone came fast, one ring, then two, before a voice picked up, low-clipped and unmistakably alert. Elijah, the voice said, not a question but a recognition. "Tell me it's not what I think." "It's exactly what you think," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "Truck stop, diner, County Road 12. Two deputies, names Bell and Mercer. One's pushing hard, the other's watching it happen." There was a pause on the other end long enough to mean something. Then, "Are you safe?" "I'm seated, coffee in hand. But I'm not here to talk safety. I need eyes. I need pressure. I need this to move." Another pause, then the voice came back stronger. "You calling this in for you or for someone else?" Elijah looked around the room, let his gaze fall on Jenna, still wiping down a perfectly clean section of counter, her movements nervous and precise. Then his eyes shifted to the booth near the back, where a young man no older than 20 sat with headphones dangling from one ear, staring at him with that particular wide-eyed look that only came from seeing something that didn't match the world you'd been taught to expect. "For all of them," Elijah said softly. "For every time it happens and no one records, no one calls, no one listens." The voice on the other end exhaled. "Understood. Give me 10 minutes, maybe less." Elijah hung up, closed the phone with the quiet snap of certainty, and placed it back in his coat. He didn't puff up with pride, didn't make a speech, or turn to the room with some grand pronouncement. He just sat there steady and composed, letting the weight of his actions rest where it belonged, not in what had been said, but in what had been started. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten just slightly, the thick overcast giving way to a softer gray, like a hand unclenching after a long, hard grip. The rain had thinned to a mist again, dancing on the asphalt in ghostly spirals, and the occasional headlights of passing trucks cut through the fog like brief flickers of clarity. Inside, Craig finally stepped fully back into the kitchen, muttering something about eggs being overcooked, though everyone knew he'd just needed something to say. Jenna poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned lightly against the counter watching Elijah, without speaking, her expression no longer fearful, but not quite at ease either. "You think he'll come back?" she asked quietly, voice just above the hum of the overhead fan. Elijah looked up, his face unreadable but gentle. "Maybe. But next time he'll think twice." She nodded slowly. "And the call?" Elijah offered a small smile, not of triumph, but of patience. "That's still ringing." Moments passed, and then the sound of tires on gravel broke through the air, subtle but sure. A dark, gray sedan pulled into the lot, sleek and clean, not patrol, but something sharper, civilian on the outside, but with that unmistakable confidence of someone who never needed a uniform to be taken seriously. The driver stepped out before the engine even stopped humming. Slender, mid-40s, dark suit, phone in hand, stride purposeful. He moved like someone who already knew where he was going and exactly why he was needed. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, his eyes sweeping the room, pausing only briefly on each face until they landed on Elijah. Then with a nod he turned to Jenna. "Coffee black," he said. "To go." Jenna moved instinctively, pouring the cup before she even asked for payment. "On the house," she said quietly. He accepted the cup but didn't take a sip. Instead, he walked toward Elijah's table and leaned in just slightly. "Name's Owen Price," he said. "Internal affairs. And you, my friend, just lit a fire I've been waiting to walk into." Elijah looked up, his voice calm. "Took your time." Owen smiled. "You called early. I was already in motion." Then, without raising his voice, without asking permission, he turned to the rest of the room and said one thing. Something simple but final. "Deputy Bell, step outside with me. Now." The diner went still again, not from fear but from awe. Elijah sat back, coffee in hand, and for the first time in a long while he let himself believe that justice might still know how to knock on a door. The way Owen Price said those 5 words, "Deputy Bell, step outside with me," wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but it cut through the air like a blade, honed by years of precision and restraint. It wasn't a request, and it wasn't a threat. It was a statement wrapped in the calm authority of someone who didn't need to prove he had power, only to remind you that he knew exactly when and how to use it. The diner froze in that moment, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see whether the man in the uniform would obey or resist, whether the badge on his chest meant service or control. Bell didn't answer immediately. His mouth twitched as though caught between a smirk and a snarl, but his eyes had narrowed not in defiance but calculation. He looked at Price the way a man looks at a chessboard after realizing the next 3 moves are already decided. Mercer, still hovering near the door, shifted uncomfortably, his hand grazing the edge of his utility belt before dropping back to his side, fingers curling loosely like he didn't know what to do with them anymore. Jenna's eyes flicked from one man to the other, the coffee pot in her hand frozen mid-pour, a ribbon of steam rising quietly into the stillness. Owen didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. He just held his stance, casual but unshakable, like someone who had walked into 100 rooms like this and knew how to hold every one of them. Now he said again softly but with finality. Bell's shoulders tensed just slightly, the fabric of his uniform, straining at the seams, and for a second it looked like he might push back, might snap out a rehearsed line about jurisdiction or procedure or chain of command. But then he looked around. The room had turned on him, and he knew it. Craig stood at the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, jaw clenched tight. The truckers in the back booth had stopped pretending to eat. Even the teenager near the jukebox had taken out his earbuds again, staring with that unblinking curiosity only the very young possess when they sense something real is happening, something that might not come again. Bell turned his head slowly toward Elijah, who hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't spoken since Owen arrived, and yet held the gravity of the whole situation like it was resting on the edge of his table. "You got paperwork for this?" Bell asked, finally, voice low and bitter. "Or is this one of those show-up-and-scare-the-good-guys stunts?" Owen raised an eyebrow and reached into his coat. Not hurried, not aggressive, just precise. He pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open to reveal a badge, one that didn't glint or flash, but somehow carried more weight than the metal shield Bell wore on his own chest. "Wake County Internal Affairs," he said evenly. "Complaint Review Division, badge number 0729. You've been flagged twice, and today just made it 3. Bell stared at the badge, then at Owen, and finally at Mercer, who stepped back instinctively, eyes wide. "Wait," Mercer said. "Flagged." For what Owen turned slightly to include him in the conversation, voice still calm, but with a note of disappointment that cut sharper than anger. "Once for excessive force on a traffic stop last fall. Another for inappropriate conduct during a noise complaint call in April. Both times you were there. Both times your signature appears on the incident summary." "I didn't touch anybody," Mercer said quickly, his tone defensive now. "I didn't even write the reports." "No," Owen replied, "but you stood there, and that's enough." Bell shook his head, a grim smile twisting at the corner of his mouth. "None of those stuck. IA closed the files." "They were closed," Owen said, "because your captain buried them. But they've just been reopened, and with what I saw today there's plenty to work with." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Bell and Mercer could hear. "You want to keep pushing, we can go straight to criminal misconduct. Or you step outside and we do this quietly." Bell didn't speak, but something in his posture gave way a slight sag in the shoulders, the kind that happens when a man realizes his bluff has been called in public and the table has already folded on him. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, each step slower than the last, as if the weight of what had just happened was only beginning to settle in. Mercer hesitated, then followed, not quite looking at anyone, especially not Elijah. When the bell above the door rang again, and the 2 deputies stepped into the gray light outside, it felt like the diner finally took its first full breath in nearly half an hour. Owen followed them without glancing back, the door swinging closed behind him with a soft thud. Elijah remained in his seat, both hands resting on the table, the coffee now cold but untouched, his eyes, still watching the door like a man who knows the battle isn't over just because the noise has quieted. Jenna approached carefully, her voice unsure. "Are you okay?" she asked. Elijah turned toward her, blinking slowly as if returning from somewhere far off. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired." She nodded and looked at the mug in front of him. "Want me to warm that up?" He considered for a moment, then gave a quiet nod. "Yeah, sure." She took the cup gently, the heat of her hand, brushing his for half a second longer than it needed to. Then she turned and walked back to the counter, the world beginning to move again, slowly, carefully, like a town after a storm. Outside, the fog still drifted low across the lot, curling around tires and windshields, softening the edges of reality into something quieter, more bearable. But the edge of something permanent had just cut through that mist, and Elijah could feel it, not as noise, not as glory, but as a shift. A line had been drawn, and for once someone had shown up to stand on it with him. Outside the diner, the air had thickened with a kind of quiet that wasn't about weather or traffic, but the stillness of accountability approaching. Owen stood just beyond the door, his coat collar turned up against the mist, watching as Bell and Mercer hovered near their cruiser, no longer the confident figures who had strutted in earlier, but 2 men who now looked unsure of where the edge had been drawn or who had drawn it. He didn't rush toward them, didn't raise his voice or call out across the lot. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, with the kind of posture that doesn't need volume to be heard, only presence to be felt. Bell was pacing, hands on hips, muttering under his breath, like a man trying to convince himself of an argument he knew wouldn't hold. Mercer leaned against the cruiser, arms crossed, his gaze bouncing between the gravel at his feet and the faint glow of the diner behind them. Owen stopped a few feet away, his shoes scuffing quietly against the damp asphalt, and waited until the silence settled again before speaking. "You know how this works," he said calmly. "This isn't the first time either of your names has come across my desk." Bell turned sharply, his face a mixture of defiance and panic, the kind that simmers just beneath the skin when a man realizes the system that used to protect him is now looking straight through him. "Those complaints didn't stick," he snapped, voice tight. "None of them held up. IA cleared every single one." "They didn't stick," Owen repeated, his voice soft, almost sympathetic, "because your captain buried them. Not because they weren't true." He pulled a small notepad from his coat and flipped it open, pages slightly damp from the air but still readable. Traffic stop. November 14th, driver reports bruising after being pulled from the vehicle. No charges filed, no video logged. You were there. Bell's jaw clenched. He resisted. "And no body cam footage survived that night," Owen said evenly. "Interesting pattern." "Then there's the noise complaint in April. Female resident reported inappropriate remarks and physical intimidation. Said you pushed her against the wall when she asked to see your badge." "She was drunk," Bell growled. "And disrespectful." Owen nodded slightly, scribbled something without looking up. "And yet no follow-up, no internal interview, no written report. But your partner signed off." He looked at Mercer now, who straightened as if trying to brace against something coming. "You were there. You backed him up." Mercer's mouth opened, then closed again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried more truth than Bell's entire file. "I didn't touch anyone." "No," Owen agreed, "but you watched, you saw, and you said nothing. That makes you part of it." Bell stepped forward, shoulders squared, voice rising. "This is a damn hit job. You think some homeless vet with a phone and a grudge is gonna take me down?" Owen didn't move, didn't flinch. "That homeless vet," he said, "has a Bronze Star and a record of service that would make most men ashamed to speak in his presence." He paused, letting the words settle. "And you tried to humiliate him in front of a room full of witnesses. That wasn't bad judgment. That was a pattern finally catching up to you." Back inside, Elijah sat watching through the window, the reflection of his own face superimposed over the scene outside, one man watching the unraveling of a system he'd spent years learning not to trust. He didn't feel vindicated, not yet. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a process, slow and full of false starts. But watching Bell's posture crack, seeing Mercer avoid every eye in sight, he knew something had shifted. Owen tapped his phone, once screen lighting up in his hand. "Captain Russo's on his way. You're both being placed on temporary suspension effective immediately, while we reopen all complaints from the past 3 years. You got no case," Bell muttered. "This doesn't go anywhere." Owen slipped the phone into his pocket and pulled out a small voice recorder, clicked it once, and let the beep echo between them. "This morning's events have been recorded from the moment I stepped into that diner. Your comments, your reactions, and the phone call from Sergeant Carter archived. If you'd like to test how much of this doesn't stick once it goes statewide, be my guest." Mercer's shoulders dropped and Bell turned away, muttering curses that didn't carry meaning anymore. They were just sound now, empty of power. For the first time in a long while, the ground beneath them wasn't solid, and both men knew it. Inside, Jenna stepped out from behind the counter, her hands still damp from wiping down a table that hadn't been used. She leaned slightly toward Elijah's booth, speaking low, almost like she didn't trust the quiet. "Was that really internal affairs?" Elijah nodded, his eyes still on the window. "Used to be Specialist Price. Served with me in Kandahar. Tougher than he looks." She blinked, lips parted, then closed them again. "I didn't know who you were," she said. "I mean, I saw the jacket, but I didn't know." "That's the point," Elijah replied. "You're not supposed to. We don't walk around announcing it. We live with it." He paused, letting the moment hold. "But sometimes you get tired of being treated like trash just because you don't have a zip code anymore." The teenager near the jukebox turned slowly and walked over, curiosity beating out hesitation. He looked up at Elijah, eyes wide. "Were they gonna arrest you?" Elijah considered the question, then offered the ghost of a smile. "They were gonna try." "Why?" the boy asked, his voice caught between wonder and confusion. "Because people in charge get lazy," Elijah said. "And when they get lazy, they start thinking no one will push back, especially not someone who looks like me." Outside, the fog began to lift slightly, the sun trying to press through in small golden streaks that laced the lot with a new kind of light. It wasn't warm yet, and it didn't promise the day would be clear, but it was something. A beginning. A crack in the gray. And for Elijah Carter, that was enough for now. Outside the diner, Bell was pacing like a man who just realized the ground under him wasn't as solid as he'd always assumed. His steps clipped uneven the way someone moves when they've never had to answer for anything, and suddenly find the silence around them asking questions they can't explain away. Mercer leaned on the back of the cruiser, arms crossed, but loose now, not folded in authority, more in retreat, as if his own skin no longer fit right beneath the uniform. Owen stood between them, patient, but unmoved, his phone back in his coat pocket, his badge still visible in his hand, not brandished, but present a reminder of the weight behind every word he said. He didn't speak again right away. He let the fog fill the space, let the two deputies sit in their own discomfort, because sometimes the most honest truths come, not when someone is cornered, but when they're left alone with the echo of their own behavior. Bell was still muttering, his hands moving from his hips to his belt and back again, like he didn't know what to do if he wasn't holding the center of the room. "This is gonna blow over," he said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. "It always does." Owen's eyes stayed on him, but his tone didn't change. Not this time. Inside the diner, Elijah had finally moved from the booth, not in defeat, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who'd seen worse and survived it. He walked to the counter and leaned gently on the edge. Hands folded, the steam from a fresh cup of coffee drifting upward between his fingers. Jenna poured without a word, her movements precise, measured, like she finally understood that this wasn't about service, but about witnessing something she hadn't had the language to name until now. "You think they'll really face anything?" she asked softly, eyes down, not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she already suspected it. Elijah looked at her, his voice low and even. "I think something started today. Whether it finishes depends on who keeps watching." That answer seemed to settle into her shoulders like a truth she could carry, and she gave a small nod, the kind that doesn't end a conversation but lets it rest. Craig came out from the kitchen again, wiping his hands on a towel, glancing toward the windows, like a man who'd heard enough to know his silence had once protected the wrong people. He didn't say anything to Elijah, but his look held something: recognition, maybe even gratitude. Not for the fight, but for showing where the line had been all along. Back outside, Owen checked his watch, then turned slightly toward Bell. "Captain Russo will be here in 5, he said. "He's been briefed. Don't expect him to cover for you." Bell scoffed, that brittle, hollow sound of someone who's already lost the high ground but hasn't let their ego catch up to the fall. "Russo's always had my back," he said, voice sharper now. "You think he's gonna throw me under the bus because of some sob story in a diner?" Owen's expression didn't shift, but his voice did, cooler, with a weight that didn't need to rise. He's going to do it because he's next." The sentence landed like a quiet hammer, not shouted, not harsh, just final. Mercer turned his head, and for the first time since this started, looked Owen in the eye. "He covered for us?" he asked, but the word "us" didn't sound like confidence anymore. It sounded like regret. Owen nodded once. 12 complaints. 8 never followed up. 3 closed without interviews. 1 still pending. Every file marked "no action needed," and every one of them signed off by Russo. Bell didn't have a comeback this time. His hands dropped to his sides. He looked toward the horizon like someone hoping for a distraction, a bird, a siren, a storm, but there was only the soft gray light of morning and the sound of gravel shifting beneath tires as another unmarked car pulled up beside the cruiser. Elijah watched from inside, one hand on his coffee, the other resting lightly on the counter. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. His face was calm, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already done what you came to do. Jenna stood beside him, her eyes flicking from the window back to him. "Who was that guy again?" she asked. "Owen? Used to be Specialist Price," Elijah replied. "Back when the fight was across the ocean." She nodded slowly. "You saved his life or something?" Elijah shrugged. "Depends how you define saved. We were in the same convoy when it got hit. I pulled him out. That's all. And now he's here," Jenna said almost to herself, "answering your call." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked back out the window toward the men who once thought their badges made them untouchable. "Some debts don't disappear," he said. "They wait, and when the time's right, they come due." Outside, Captain Russo had arrived. Stocky, bald, his face drawn tighter than it had been in years, he stepped out of his vehicle and walked toward Owen with slow, resigned steps. The two men spoke quietly too far for the diner's patrons to hear, but the body language told enough. Russo didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He just listened, then turned toward Bell and Mercer with an expression that said whatever loyalty once lived between them was now something buried and rotting. Owen walked back toward the diner, brushing a few raindrops from his jacket, and when he stepped through the door, the quiet picked up again, not out of fear, but respect. Elijah met his eyes, and for a moment neither said anything. Then Owen spoke. "It's done for now. They're off duty. Suspension is active. Files are being pulled." Elijah nodded. "Should have happened years ago." Owen sighed, then said quietly, "Yeah, but better now than never." The two men stood there, not as soldiers, not as officers, not even as accuser and investigator, but as two people who'd both spent time in places where justice had to be fought for by hand, not handed out by systems. And on this morning, in a quiet diner, off a fog-covered road, something had finally cracked. Not everything, but enough to let the light start leaking through. By the following morning, the story had started to ripple far beyond the foggy parking lot of that roadside diner, moving first through quiet conversations, then faster through phone calls, and finally spilling out across local news channels with cautious headlines and clipped sound bites. It didn't lead the evening broadcast, not yet, but it landed with just enough weight to catch the attention of anyone who'd ever wondered what happens when the wrong people wear the right uniforms. The footage, grainy but clear, showed Bell standing tense at the edge of the counter, his boot nudging Elijah's bag, his body language unmistakable. There was no shouting, no violence, just the slow unraveling of authority that had mistaken silence for submission. The diner's owner, Stan Riley, a former Marine who hadn't been there that morning, but heard the whole thing within hours, released a short video on social media that night, his voice shaking with emotion as he said, "We serve everyone here. Anyone who disrespects a vet in my building doesn't represent this town." The post went viral, not because it was polished or dramatic, but because it was real and because it spoke to something deeper than the incident itself. The comments came in waves, some outraged, others defensive, but many just quiet messages from strangers saying they'd seen too much of this and were tired of pretending it was rare. Elijah didn't watch the news that night. He spent it sitting on the back steps of the shelter, where he usually found a cot when the weather turned. The flip phone still resting in his coat pocket like a reminder of how much one call could carry. He wasn't waiting for recognition. He didn't need a headline to tell him what he'd already lived through. But he did take the time to breathe slower, to let the tension in his chest unwind itself just a little, to know that for once he hadn't had to walk away quieter than he'd arrived. The next morning, Jenna called. Her voice trembled just slightly, like she'd rehearsed the message more than once. "I didn't know what to say that day," she admitted. "But I should have said something. I'm sorry." Elijah listened without interrupting, letting her get through the words she'd clearly needed to speak. When she finished, he replied with a calmness that didn't let her off the hook but gave her space to grow. "You did more than most," he said. "You brought the coffee." She let out a soft laugh, half embarrassed, half relieved. "Still," she said, "it doesn't sit right." "It's not supposed to," Elijah answered. "That's the point." By midweek, Internal Affairs had confirmed the suspensions of both deputies and opened a formal review of their past conduct. Local advocacy groups picked up the scent, quickly demanding full public disclosure of civilian complaints and pushing for broader departmental oversight. Flyers were posted in libraries and laundromats, calling for a community forum. Some neighbors who'd never spoken out before suddenly found the courage to share stories. They'd kept tucked away stories about being pulled over for no reason, about late-night noise calls that turned into confrontations about sons and nephews and brothers who'd been made to feel like suspects just for existing in the wrong skin. At the town meeting that Thursday night, an older woman named Lorraine Pierce stood up with a manila folder clenched tight in her wrinkled hands. Her voice wavered at first but steadied with each word, as she described how Deputy Bell had thrown her 16-year-old son against a squad car 2 years ago for mouthing off. "I filed a complaint," she said, her voice rising, but nothing happened. "They told me it was my word against his, but now I know I wasn't the only one." The room went quiet after that. Not because they didn't believe her, but because the silence was filled with all the names and faces that hadn't made it into the room. Elijah didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to. His presence had already lit the fuse. Instead, he spent the evening walking the edge of a church parking lot where volunteers were handing out foil-wrapped sandwiches to anyone willing to meet eye contact. He didn't speak much, just nodded, passed plates, and sat beside a man named Curtis, who used to run a small engine repair shop before the bank took his house and the street took the rest. "You really got those two kicked off the force?" Curtis asked, unwrapping his food slowly. Elijah shook his head. "They kicked themselves off," he said. "I just pulled back the curtain." Curtis chuckled low in his throat, more gravel than laughter. "Well, it's about time somebody did." Elijah didn't answer right away. He just looked out toward the rows of folding tables, the steam rising from soup containers, the way people relaxed. Once they realized nobody here was going to ask for a story or a reason or a clean past. That was the part most folks didn't understand. Sometimes justice doesn't look like a courtroom or a podium or a plaque on the wall. Sometimes it looks like a quiet night where nobody's looking to throw you out, where you can eat in peace, sit in peace, be. And for Elijah Carter, that was worth more than any headline. Because real change didn't come with applause. It came in the absence of fear, in the way a room shifted, in the way eyes didn't look away anymore. It came quietly. And it stayed. A few days after the town meeting, the sun finally cut through the haze that had hung over the streets for what felt like weeks, casting long golden rays across rooftops and broken sidewalks, like some small apology from the sky. Elijah sat alone on a bench outside the community center, sipping weak tea from a styrofoam cup, watching the kids from the shelter ride second-hand bikes in crooked circles, their laughter loud enough to remind him that joy, real unfiltered, joy didn't need permission to exist even in places where dignity had once been denied. He shifted slightly, adjusting the weight of his coat around his shoulders, the familiar tug of fabric grounding him in the moment, the way a soldier learns to carry silence like armor. His phone buzzed against his thigh, the screen lighting up with a number he recognized, but hadn't expected so soon. He answered without hesitation. "Carter," he said, his voice even no rush, no need for greetings between men who'd already bled together once. Owen's voice came through clear. "They've both submitted retirement paperwork, effective immediately. No pension." There was a pause, just long enough to let it sink in. "Russo's been reassigned. Pending full departmental review." Elijah didn't respond at first. He let the words settle like dust in a room that had been locked too long. He stared out at the kids, watched as one nearly crashed into the curb and laughed anyway, legs flailing, handlebars twisted. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" he asked. Not sarcastic, not bitter, just tired in that way. Only people who have spent years surviving injustice without the luxury of outrage can ever truly sound. "It's not a win," Owen replied, "but it's movement." Elijah took another sip of tea, the liquid lukewarm and tasteless, but comforting in its simplicity. "Movement's good," he said. "But you and I both know how often it circles back on itself." Owen didn't argue. He just listened because he understood what Elijah wasn't saying out loud, that justice delayed might not always be justice denied, but it damn well leaves scars in the meantime. "There's talk of recognition," Owen added. "The department wants to issue a commendation. Public statement. Maybe even invite you to speak." Elijah's answer came fast, firm, and final. "They didn't protect me. They don't get to celebrate me." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on a crack in the pavement that split like a vein through the sidewalk. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for someone to hear the next woman who says she was followed too long down a road that should have been safe. I want someone to believe the next man who says he was stopped without cause before it becomes a headline." Owen exhaled through the line. "You want change without the ceremony. I want respect without a damn ribbon." They didn't speak again for a minute, the silence not uncomfortable, but full, like two men standing on opposite shores, connected by something deeper than words, something that comes from choosing not to look away when it would have been easier to. Later that afternoon, Elijah returned to the shelter's kitchen and spent an hour stirring a giant pot of lentil stew, seasoning it with practiced care, while volunteers prepped bags of bread and fruit. He liked the rhythm of it, the repetition, the purpose, the quiet dignity of service that expected nothing in return. As the line of guests began to form near the double doors, he handed bowls across the counter, making eye contact with each person, offering a nod, a smile, sometimes a quiet word. No preaching, no story, just presence. Then, through the rustling of coats and the scrape of plastic trays, a voice called out his name, soft but sure, with the kind of tone that doesn't ask for attention so much as offer it. He turned and saw Jenna standing near the doorway, her hair tied back, a canvas tote slung over one shoulder and 2 paper bags in her hands. "Heard you were working here," she said. "Brought lunch. Hope you still like turkey and mustard." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "You drove all the way for that." She handed him the bag with a shrug. "Not just for that." They sat together on the back steps, elbows touching the late sun, casting long shadows across the gravel. She didn't say much at first, just chewed slowly, occasionally sipping from a bottle of water, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. After a while she asked, "You ever think about writing it all down, what happened that day?" "I think about it," Elijah said. "But writing it makes it feel clean." It wasn't clean. Still isn't. "Maybe that's why people need to hear it," she said quietly. "Because it's not clean." He didn't respond right away. He watched as a man in a wheelchair rolled up to the fence, laughing at something a little girl said on the other side. Then he turned to her and said, "You know what? I realized after that morning, respect isn't owed to uniforms, it's owed to character. You can wear a badge or carry a rifle or sit behind a judge's bench, but none of that means a thing if you treat people like they're less than you." Jenna nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around her bottle. "I think about that too. You saw something that day. You felt it." He tilted his head. "What did I feel?" "That little discomfort in your gut," she said. "That voice that says this isn't right. Most folks ignore it." "I didn't ignore it this time," she added almost to herself. "Thanks to you." Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. The moment already held more truth than words could carry. As they stood to leave, Jenna hesitated, her voice low. "What are you going to do next?" Elijah looked around the lot then, toward the people gathering for evening meal service. "Help out here. Listen. Make sure the next vet who walks into a diner doesn't get asked to leave." Jenna smiled. "Not big, not performative, just real. Doesn't sound small to me." Elijah smiled back. "That's because now you're paying attention." A week later, the headlines had begun to quiet down, fading like tire tracks on wet asphalt, still visible but no longer fresh enough to stop traffic. The town, like so many others before it, had already begun to shift its focus to zoning ordinances, school budgets, and who was going to coach the high school baseball team that spring. But for Elijah, the story hadn't ended, not really. Because stories like his don't wrap themselves in clean conclusions or public apologies, they linger like smoke in old fabric, refusing to be washed out by time or convenience. That morning he was back at the shelter early, organizing donated jackets by size, folding them slowly and methodically, the rhythm grounding him in a way words couldn't. The cold had returned after a brief flirtation with spring, biting at the edge of the windows, casting long, pale light across the floors. Outside, the sidewalk was still slick from frost, and the breath of early risers curled in the air like steam from a tired engine. Elijah moved quietly, nodding to the volunteers who passed, some familiar, others, new, all of them bringing with them the cautious warmth of people trying to do good in a world that didn't always reward it. He was halfway through sorting a bin of gloves when Owen called again. "Just got out of the hearing," he said, skipping any greeting. "Everything's stuck. Pensions denied. Russo's officially out." Elijah didn't say much. He just closed the lid of the bin and leaned against the shelf, letting the weight of it all rest somewhere below his collarbone. "Any noise?" he asked. Owen gave a quiet laugh. "Plenty. Lawyers tried spinning it, called it a character assassination campaign. One of them even said Bell had been under extreme pressure for years." "And the board?" Elijah asked. "Unanimous," Owen replied. "Even the ones I thought would fold." That word unanimous echoed in Elijah's chest for a moment longer than it should have, not because it meant triumph, but because it meant something rare. A room full of people who usually disagreed had finally seen enough. He rubbed his forehead, thumb tracing the scar just above his left brow, the one no one ever asked about but everyone noticed. "It's good," he said softly. "Not perfect, but good." Owen paused, then added, "You sure about turning down the statement? This could still go national. Your voice would matter." "I know it would," Elijah replied. "But not like this. I don't want them turning it into a redemption story for the system." It wasn't the system that stepped in. It was a man who remembered a debt, and a waitress who didn't look away. There was silence after that, not awkward or strained, but full, the kind of silence that stretches between two people who understand there are truths deeper than explanation. "You still at the shelter?" Owen asked. "Yeah," Elijah said, "sorting coats. Winter's not done with us yet." Later that day, Jenna stopped by again, this time with two kids from the local high school who were volunteering for community credit. She waved through the window, her eyes bright beneath the knit cap pulled low on her head, and Elijah stepped outside to greet her. "Brought reinforcements," she said, handing him a clipboard with sign-in sheets. "And a new bulletin for the rec center. They're adding a community listening circle, something about giving folks a place to talk without shouting." Elijah scanned the paper, his eyes lingering on a sentence near the bottom. "Respect doesn't start with rules. It starts with being heard." He nodded. "It's a start." Inside, the two teens helped unpack a box of canned goods, while Jenna watched them from the corner, arms crossed, her expression both amused and quietly proud. Elijah stood near the counter, sipping from a chipped mug, the scent of coffee and dusty cardboard wrapping around him like an old coat. "You think it's gonna stick?" she asked. "All of this? The changes?" He looked at her for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward the far wall, where a small poster had been tacked up. "Veterans welcome here. No questions." It wasn't big, it wasn't bold, but it was real. "It won't stick on its own," he said. "But if enough people keep showing up, keep remembering what it felt like when things weren't right, then maybe," she nodded slowly. "Guess that's what change looks like, huh? Not fireworks, just people paying attention." "Fireworks burn out fast," Elijah said, "but attention that lingers." Outside, the wind had picked up again, rustling loose leaves down the street, carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke and diesel from a nearby bus stop. Elijah watched the sky shift from gray to gold behind the clouds, light filtering through, like something old trying to make itself new again. He didn't believe in closure, not really. But he believed in continuity, in the power of one day, following the next of small choices, adding up to something bigger than the person making them. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the lot, he helped the last volunteer lock up the back gate, the key cold in his hand, the sound of the latch clicking shut, feeling more like a promise than a finish. He stood there for a moment, staring at nothing in particular, then whispered to himself more than anyone else, "We hold the line, even when no one claps for it." And in that quiet, beneath the fading hum of the city and the soft scuff of shoes on concrete, there was something steady, like the sound of a flag not being raised in victory, but simply not being lowered again. 2 months passed, and though the heat of the headlines had cooled, their embers still glowed quietly beneath the surface of the town. Things had changed, not in a dramatic, sweeping way that made evening news anchors lean forward at their desks, but in the subtler, more lasting ways that only people who've lived through silence can truly recognize. A few new faces had joined the department, younger officers trained with new language, new policies, and if you looked closely, new eyes that watched not to judge, but to understand. The community had appointed a liaison, someone who didn't wear a badge, but had the trust of those who'd stopped believing in uniforms. And the council, under quiet pressure, passed a motion requiring all civilian complaints be preserved and accessible for no less than 5 years. No more missing paperwork. No more sealed files. Elijah didn't attend the press briefings or ribbon cuttings. He wasn't interested in standing behind a podium while officials smiled for the cameras and pretended they'd always been on the right side of history. Instead, he found his way to Greensboro, about an hour away, where a transitional housing center for homeless veterans was in desperate need of help. No one there asked for his backstory. They asked if he could cook, if he could fix the broken laundry machine, and if he knew how to listen when someone just needed to talk without being told how to feel. The answer to all three was yes. He kept his duffel bag by the side of his cot, still zipped tight, still patched with the same faded duct tape that had traveled with him through more cities than he cared to count. He wore a new coat, lighter, cleaner, fewer holes, but still preferred to keep the collar turned up, not out of habit but out of quiet defense. Some days he swept the back steps. Other days, he cleaned out the supply closet or walked the perimeter fence at dusk, his breath slow, his eyes always scanning not for threats, but for people being left out of the frame. One afternoon, as he was breaking down cardboard boxes behind the kitchen, he heard a voice call out his name, gentle, but certain, the kind of voice that doesn't interrupt, just enters a space like it belongs there. He turned and saw Jenna walking across the grass wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, a canvas tote slung over her shoulder and a paper bag in each hand. "Brought lunch," she said. "Hope you're still into turkey and mustard." Elijah raised an eyebrow and smiled, the kind of smile that lives mostly in the eyes. "You drove all this way just for that." Jenna handed him the bag. "Not just for that." They sat together on the curb behind the building, their backs pressed to the warm brick wall, the hum of distant traffic mixing with the soft rustle of leaves overhead. They didn't speak for a while, just chewed slowly, the paper bags crinkling between their knees, the air full of the kind of silence that felt earned rather than awkward. Eventually she turned to him, her voice low. "You ever think about writing it down, not for the press or a book, just so it lives somewhere?" Elijah thought about it, really thought about it. He stared across the yard at a man in a wheelchair laughing with a little girl near the fence, her hands sticky with popsicle juice, his head thrown back in pure joy. Then he answered, "I've thought about it. But writing makes it too clean." "What happened that day? It wasn't clean. Still isn't." Jenna nodded. "Maybe that's exactly why people need to hear it." Elijah took a breath, held it, then let it go slow. "You know what I figured out after all this? Respect isn't owed to titles, not to uniforms, not to medals, not even to experience. It's owed to character. And character shows up when no one's watching, when no one's clapping, when it's easier to look away." She didn't say anything right away. Just looked at him, her eyes softer, now steadier. "You saw something in that room," she said. "Something the rest of us didn't see until it was too late." He turned toward her. "I saw people looking for permission to care. That's what stops most folks, not hate, hesitation. That split second where your conscience speaks up and you have to decide if you'll listen." Jenna nodded. "Most people ignore that voice." He looked back out at the grass. "You didn't—" She was quiet for a moment, then reached into her bag and handed him a folded flyer. It was from the diner. On the front, in plain black letters, it said, "Veterans, welcome here, no questions." He unfolded it, slowly ran his thumb along the edge. "It's not loud," she said. "But it's honest. That's all it needs to be." As the sun started to dip, casting long shadows across the lawn, Jenna stood to leave. She hesitated, then asked, "What should I say to the next person who walks in and looks like you, and I feel that voice in my gut?" Elijah stood too, brushing crumbs from his jeans. "Ask yourself one thing," he said. "What would it cost you to show respect instead?" She nodded, not just in agreement, but in understanding, the kind that stays. That night, Elijah sat on his cot, the flip phone on the windowsill beside him, screen dark, battery low, but still alive. It hadn't rung in days. That was fine. He wasn't waiting for anything. He was exactly where he needed to be, in a room with no applause, no spotlight, just quiet. And sometimes that was the most honest justice of all, because the truth never needed to be loud. It just needed to be seen. And from that moment forward, he knew he'd been seen. And maybe that in the end was enough. What happened in that quiet roadside diner wasn't just about two officers or one man with a worn coat and a tired face. It was about something bigger. It was about what we choose to see or not see when someone walks into a room and doesn't look like they belong. It was about silence, complicity, and the courage it takes to break that cycle, not with anger but with dignity. Elijah's story reminds us that respect isn't owed to a uniform but to character. And character isn't proven when everyone's watching. It's shown in those quiet, uncomfortable moments when doing the right thing might come at a cost. For anyone listening today, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see cycles repeat, this story is a call to pay attention, to speak up when our gut says this isn't right, to recognize that justice isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a coffee shop, a quiet phone call, a simple sign on a diner window. So if this story moved you even just a little, if it reminded you of something you've lived or something you've seen, we ask you please like, share, and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because stories like this matter. Because maybe someone in your circle needs to hear that doing the right thing is still possible even in a broken world. And maybe, just maybe, the next time they see someone being pushed to the edge, they'll remember Elijah and they'll choose to stand up instead of look away.